The old blue sedan pulled into the driveway of the small house on Maple Street just as the sun began to set. Marcus Johnson stepped out first, stretching his back after the long drive from the airport. His two brothers followed, Derek and Andre, all three men looking exactly alike except for small differences only their family could spot. They were 32 years old and had been born just minutes apart from each other. The house belonged to their grandmother, Helen Johnson, who had raised them after their parents died in a car crash when the boys were 12. She was turning 85 tomorrow, and this was the first time in 3 years all three brothers could be together for her birthday. Their work kept them busy and far from home most of the time. Marcus knocked on the front door while his brothers grabbed their bags from the car. The door opened and their grandmother's face lit up with joy. She was a small woman with gray hair and warm brown eyes that sparkled when she smiled. She hugged each of her grandsons tightly, tears running down her cheeks. "My boys are home," she whispered. "All three of my boys are finally home." The brothers had told their grandmother they worked for the government in security jobs that required travel. This was not exactly a lie, but it was not the whole truth either. Marcus, Derek, and Andre Johnson were Navy SEALs, some of the most trained soldiers in the world. They had spent the last 15 years on secret missions that they could never talk about, not even to the woman who raised them. The town of Millbrook was quiet and peaceful. Most people here had lived their whole lives in the same place. The Johnson brothers looked like regular men in their jeans and t-shirts. Nobody would guess that Marcus could stay underwater for impossible amounts of time and blow up enemy ships. Nobody would think that Derek could hit a target from over a mile away with a single shot. Nobody would believe that Andre had led dozens of rescue missions in the most dangerous places on Earth. But someone was watching them. Craig Bennett sat in his pickup truck across the street, smoking a cigarette and staring at the three black men who had just arrived. Craig was the leader of a group called the Iron Brotherhood. The group had 8 members who believed that white people were better than everyone else. They hated anyone who was not white, especially black people. Craig had been planning something for months. He wanted to hurt some black people to send a message to others in the town. When he saw 3 black men arrive with out-of-state license plates, he thought they would be perfect targets. They were not from Millbrook, so nobody would miss them right away. They looked like regular city people who probably had never been in a real fight. Craig called his second-in-command, Kyle Murphy, on his cell phone. Kyle was almost as mean as Craig and twice as stupid. He believed everything Craig told him about white people being superior to everyone else. "I found our targets," Craig said into the phone. 3 black guys just showed up at the old Johnson woman's house. "They look soft like easy pickings," Kyle laughed on the other end. "About time we had some fun around here." "When do we grab them?" "Tomorrow night," Craig said. "Let them get comfortable first. Then we take them to the warehouse and teach them their place." The Iron Brotherhood had been meeting in an old warehouse outside of town for 2 years. They had weapons hidden there and had practiced what they called interrogations on dummies. They talked big about being soldiers, but none of them had ever been in the military. They learned everything they knew about fighting from movies and video games. The next day was Helen Johnson's birthday party. Friends and neighbors came to the house to celebrate with cake and ice cream. The 3 brothers helped serve food and talked with the guests. Everyone who met them thought they were polite, well-educated young men who clearly loved their grandmother very much. Marcus told funny stories about their childhood that made everyone laugh. Derek helped elderly guests with their coats and made sure everyone had enough to eat. Andre played with the children who came with their parents, getting down on the floor to play with toy cars and dolls. The party went on until late in the evening. As the last guests were leaving, Helen Johnson hugged her grandsons again. She told them how proud she was of them and how happy it made her to have them home. "You boys be careful driving back to your hotel," she said. "The roads get dark around here at night." The brothers had rented rooms at a small motel on the other side of town. They did not want to crowd their grandmother's small house, and they were used to staying in much worse places than a clean motel room. They said goodbye to their grandmother and promised to come back in the morning for breakfast before their flights home. The 3 men got into their rental car, a plain gray sedan that looked like thousands of other cars on the road. Craig Bennett and his men were waiting. They had spent the day preparing their trap. Pete Carson and Danny White had put tire spikes across the road near Miller's Diner, a restaurant that stayed open late for truck drivers. Rick Stone and Joey Martinez were hiding in the bushes beside the road with baseball bats. Frank Lewis and Tony Brooks were sitting in a van with the engine running, ready to help load their prisoners. Craig and Kyle waited in Craig's pickup truck, both men excited about what they were going to do. They had been planning this for so long that it felt like Christmas morning to them. The Johnson brothers drove slowly through the quiet streets of Millbrook. They were relaxed and happy after spending time with their grandmother. They talked about old memories and laughed at jokes only they would understand. None of them expected trouble in this sleepy little town. They had trained to expect attacks in war zones and dangerous foreign countries. Here in small-town America, surrounded by the familiar sights of their childhood, their guard was down for the first time in years. As they approached Miller's diner, Derek noticed something strange about the road ahead. His sniper training had taught him to spot small details that most people would miss. The way the light reflected off the pavement looked wrong. "Stop the car," Derek said quietly. Marcus hit the brakes just as the front tires hit the spike strip. The tires exploded with loud popping sounds and the car skidded to a stop in the middle of the empty road. Before any of the brothers could react, men with weapons surrounded their car. Craig Bennett stepped into the headlight beams, pointing a shotgun at the windshield. "Get out of the car real slow," he yelled. "Keep your hands where we can see them." The Johnson brothers looked at each other for just a moment. In that brief glance, they shared 15 years of training and dozens of life-or-death situations. But they also knew that acting like soldiers now would put their grandmother and innocent people in danger. They stepped out of the car with their hands raised, allowing themselves to be captured by men who had no idea what they had just done. The van bounced and shook as it drove over the rough dirt road leading to the abandoned warehouse. Marcus, Derek, and Andre sat in the back with black bags over their heads and their hands tied behind them with rope. They had allowed themselves to be captured without fighting back, but every one of their senses was working. Marcus counted the turns and estimated the distance they traveled. Derek listened to the sounds outside the van, identifying the change from paved roads to gravel to dirt. Andre memorized the voices of their captors and noted how many men were with them. The van stopped after 23 minutes of driving. Rough hands pulled the brothers out and pushed them toward a building. They could hear their footsteps echoing in a large empty space. The air smelled of old motor oil and rust. Craig Bennett was feeling very pleased with himself. He had just captured 3 black men without any trouble at all. They had not even tried to fight back when his men surrounded their car. This proved everything Craig believed about black people being weak and cowardly. The warehouse had been empty for 5 years since the furniture factory closed down. Craig and his men had been using it as their meeting place and had set up what they called an interrogation room in one corner. They had chairs, ropes, and some tools they thought would scare their prisoners. Kyle Murphy removed the bags from the brothers' heads. The Johnson brothers found themselves sitting on wooden chairs in a circle of bright lights. Beyond the lights, they could see the shapes of men with guns watching them. "Welcome to your new home," Craig said, stepping into the light. He was a big man with tattoos covering his arms and a beard that had not been washed in days. "You boys are going to be our guests for a while." The brothers said nothing. They looked around the warehouse with eyes that had been trained to assess tactical situations. The building was old but sturdy, with concrete walls and a metal roof. There were at least 6 ways in and out that they could see. The lighting was poor except for the area where they sat. Their captors had made many mistakes. The guards were standing too close together and too far from cover. The weapons were not properly secured. Most importantly, none of these men moved like they had any real military training. Derek counted 8 men total. Marcus noted the locations of all the weapons he could see. Andre was already working on loosening the ropes around his wrists using techniques he had learned in survival training. Craig began talking about why he had brought them here. He used terrible words about black people and explained his belief that white people were meant to rule over everyone else. He talked about cleaning up the town and sending messages to anyone who was not white. The Johnson brothers listened without showing any emotion on their faces. They had heard this kind of hate speech before during missions in other countries. They knew that arguing with men like Craig Bennett was useless. These were people who had chosen to believe lies because the lies made them feel important. But as Craig talked, the brothers learned something that changed everything. The Iron Brotherhood was not planning to stop with them. They had a list of other black families in Millbrook that they wanted to hurt. They talked about the Martinez family that ran the grocery store, and the Washington family that had just moved to town with young children. Andre made eye contact with his brothers. In the language of looks that they had developed over 30 years together, he asked a question. Marcus and Derek both nodded slightly. The mission had just changed from escape and survival to protection of innocent people. Night fell and most of Craig's men went home to their families. Only Pete Carson and Danny White stayed to guard the prisoners. Pete was 19 years old and had joined the Iron Brotherhood because he thought it would make him tough. Danny was older but not much smarter, a man who had never succeeded at anything in his life except hating people who were different from him. The two guards sat at a card table playing poker and drinking beer. They had pistols in holsters on their belts, but the guns might as well have been on the moon, for all the good they would do against 3 Navy SEALs. Marcus tested his ropes and found that Andre had loosened them enough for all 3 brothers to slip free when the time came. Derek studied the guards' patrol pattern and timed their movements. Andre identified the weapons cache where Craig kept extra guns and ammunition. At 2 in the morning, Pete Carson got up to use the bathroom in the back of the warehouse. Danny White was half asleep in his chair, empty beer bottles scattered around his feet. The Johnson brothers moved like shadows. Andre slipped his ropes and was behind Danny before the guard knew anyone was near him. A sleeper hold learned in Special Forces training put Danny unconscious in 4 seconds without making a sound. Marcus and Derek freed themselves just as Pete came back from the bathroom. Pete saw the empty chairs and opened his mouth to yell, but Derek was already moving. One precise strike to a pressure point and Pete crumpled to the floor, alive but unconscious. The brothers now had 2 pistols, the keys to the van, and complete control of the warehouse. They could have simply driven away and been back at their grandmother's house in 30 minutes. But innocent families were in danger, and Navy SEALs do not abandon innocent people to murderers. Andre found a cell phone on Pete Carson and scrolled through the contacts. The Iron Brotherhood had been busy. There were phone numbers for other hate groups in 3 different states. There were photos of Black and Hispanic families with their addresses written underneath. There were plans for attacks on a synagogue and a mosque in the next county. Marcus discovered boxes of weapons that Craig had been buying illegally. There were enough guns and ammunition to outfit a small army. Some of the weapons had serial numbers that had been filed off, which meant they were stolen. Derek found Craig Bennett's notebook with detailed plans for what the group called a race war. Craig believed that if his group killed enough minorities, it would inspire other white people to join them. He had contact information for similar groups across the country. The brothers realized they had stumbled onto something much bigger than a local hate group. The Iron Brotherhood was part of a network of domestic terrorists who were planning coordinated attacks on innocent people. They called their commanding officer on a secure phone that Marcus always carried. Colonel Hayes listened as Andre quickly explained the situation. Within minutes, federal agents were on their way to Millbrook, but they would not arrive until morning. That left several hours for Craig Bennett and his remaining men to hurt innocent people if they discovered that their prisoners had escaped. The Johnson brothers made a decision that would have made their grandmother proud, even though she would never know about it. They were going to hunt down every member of the Iron Brotherhood before sunrise. Marcus took the weapons from the guards and secured Pete and Danny with zip ties from Andre's emergency kit. Derek disabled the van so it could not be used to chase them or escape. Andre gathered intelligence from the phones and notebooks they had found. By 3 in the morning, they had a complete list of targets. Craig Bennett lived in a trailer park on the south side of town. Kyle Murphy had an apartment above the hardware store downtown. Rick Stone lived with his mother in a house near the high school. Joey Martinez, Frank Lewis, and Tony Brooks all lived within a few miles of each other in a neighborhood called Pine Ridge. The brothers armed themselves with the captured weapons and prepared to disappear into the night. They had transformed from prisoners back into what they really were, 3 of the most dangerous men on the planet when innocent people needed protection. Craig Bennett was about to learn what happened when racist bullies picked the wrong targets. The Johnson brothers split up as they left the warehouse, each one taking a different route through the dark streets of Millbrook. They had studied the town layout using Pete Carson's cell phone and identified the fastest paths to each target. Marcus would handle the trailer park where Craig Bennett lived. Derek would take downtown and the apartment above Murphy's hardware store. Andre would cover the Pine Ridge neighborhood where 3 gang members lived close together. They moved through the shadows like ghosts, using skills learned in dozens of night operations in hostile territory. But this was different from their military missions. These were American streets in a peaceful town where normal people slept safely in their beds. The brothers had to be extremely careful not to hurt any innocent civilians, while they hunted the men who planned to terrorize those same civilians. Marcus reached the Sunset Trailer Park first. It was a collection of old mobile homes arranged in crooked rows with narrow dirt roads between them. Most of the trailers were dark, but a few had porch lights burning. Dogs barked in the distance as Marcus moved silently between the homes. Craig Bennett's trailer was easy to find because his pickup truck was parked outside with Iron Brotherhood stickers on the rear window. The trailer was bigger than most of the others and had a small wooden deck built onto the front. Light came from a window where Craig was still awake, probably waiting for a phone call from his men at the warehouse. Marcus circled the trailer twice, noting that Craig lived alone and that the nearest neighbors were far enough away that they would not hear anything, unless Craig managed to scream very loudly. The trailer had thin walls and cheap locks that would not stop a trained soldier for even 1 second. Inside the trailer, Craig Bennett was drinking beer and cleaning a hunting rifle. He was planning to visit the warehouse in the morning to see how scared his prisoners had become during their first night in captivity. He was looking forward to hearing them beg for mercy and promise to leave town forever. Craig heard a small noise outside his front door, like someone stepping on the wooden deck. He picked up his rifle and moved toward the window to look out. The porch light showed nothing but empty space. Marcus was already inside the trailer, having entered through the back door while Craig was looking out the front window. He had moved through the small space like smoke, avoiding the creaky floorboards and staying in the shadows. Craig turned around and found himself staring into the barrel of his own shotgun, which was now in the hands of one of the men he thought was tied up in the warehouse. "Hello, Craig," Marcus said quietly. "We need to talk." Craig's hand started shaking so badly that he dropped his rifle. He could not understand how one of his prisoners had escaped, found his home, and gotten inside without making any noise. The man standing in front of him moved like a professional soldier, not like the scared civilian Craig had captured a few hours ago. Meanwhile, across town, Derek was approaching the hardware store where Kyle Murphy lived in a small apartment above the shop. The building was old brick with a metal fire escape on one side. Derek climbed the fire escape as silently as a cat, using handholds that most people would never notice. Kyle was not sleeping either. He was sitting at his kitchen table, counting money that the Iron Brotherhood had stolen from a gas station the week before. He was planning to buy more weapons with his share of the money. Derek appeared at Kyle's window like a nightmare. One moment the window was empty, and the next moment a man was standing there looking in. Kyle jumped up so fast that he knocked over his chair and scattered money across the floor. The window was locked, but Derek opened it anyway using tools from his emergency kit. He climbed through the window and landed softly on Kyle's kitchen floor. "You should not leave your money where people can see it," Derek said. "Someone might think you are a criminal." Kyle reached for a pistol he kept on the kitchen counter, but Derek was much faster. The gun was in Derek's hand before Kyle could even touch it. Kyle found himself pressed against the wall with his hands behind his back, secured with zip ties that Derek had carried in his pocket. In the Pine Ridge neighborhood, Andre was dealing with 3 targets at once. Rick Stone, Joey Martinez, and Frank Lewis all lived on the same street within 2 blocks of each other. Andre had decided to handle them in order, starting with Rick Stone because he lived closest to the other 2. Rick lived with his 60-year-old mother in a small house, with a neat garden and painted fence. Mrs. Stone had no idea that her son was part of a hate group that planned to hurt innocent people. She thought Rick worked at the auto parts store and spent his evenings playing video games. Andre did not want to frighten an innocent old woman, so he waited until Rick came outside to smoke a cigarette on the back porch. Rick was nervous because he had not heard from Craig or Kyle all night, and Pete and Danny were not answering their phones. Andre stepped out of the darkness behind the garage. Rick saw him and tried to run back into the house, but Andre was much faster and much stronger. Rick found himself face down on the grass with his hands secured behind him before he could make a sound. "Your friends are safe," Andre whispered in Rick's ear, "but your days of hurting innocent people are over." Joey Martinez lived 2 houses down in a rental house with 3 other men, who were not part of the Iron Brotherhood. Andre had to be very careful not to wake the innocent roommates. He waited until Joey came home from his job at a late-night gas station. Joey parked his old car in the driveway and walked toward the front door, keys in his hand. He was tired from working all night and was not paying attention to his surroundings. Andre appeared beside him so suddenly that Joey thought he was seeing things. "Keys," Andre said quietly, holding out his hand. Joey was so scared that he could not speak. He handed over the keys and allowed Andre to guide him away from the house where his sleeping roommates would not be disturbed. Frank Lewis was the last target on Andre's list. Frank lived alone in a basement apartment underneath a family with young children. Andre could hear the children sleeping upstairs as he approached the building. He was especially careful to be quiet because waking up scared children would make his job much more difficult. Frank was not home. Andre checked the bars where Iron Brotherhood members liked to drink, but Frank was not there either. Finally, Andre found Frank's car parked outside the warehouse where the brothers had been held prisoner. Frank had come to check on the prisoners and had found Pete and Danny tied up with no sign of the three black men anywhere. He was calling Craig on his cell phone when Andre appeared behind him in the warehouse parking lot. "Craig is busy right now," Andre said, "but I can give him a message for you." Frank turned around and saw one of the men he thought were helpless prisoners. Frank had a gun in his hand, but Andre took it away so easily that Frank wondered if he had ever really been holding it. By 4 a.m, all 6 remaining members of the Iron Brotherhood had been captured by the Johnson brothers. None of them had been seriously hurt, but all of them were secured with zip ties and under guard. The brothers met back at the warehouse to compare notes. They had found evidence of planned attacks on innocent families, stolen weapons, connections to other hate groups, and enough information to keep federal investigators busy for months. Marcus had Craig Bennett tied to a chair in his own trailer. Surrounded by all the racist books and hate propaganda that Craig collected, Derek had Kyle Murphy secured in his apartment above the hardware store, sitting next to the stolen money he had been counting. Andre had Rick Stone, Joey Martinez, and Frank Lewis all secured in the warehouse where they had planned to torture innocent people. But the brothers were not finished yet. They had learned that the Iron Brotherhood was connected to hate groups in other states, and that attacks on innocent people were planned for the next week. They needed to gather more information before the federal agents arrived. The most important thing was making sure that every member of the network was identified and stopped. The Johnson brothers had not spent 15 years protecting innocent people around the world, just to let domestic terrorists hurt families in their grandmothers. Hometown Craig Bennett was about to provide them with all the information they needed, whether he wanted to or not. Craig Bennett sat tied to a chair in his own trailer, staring in disbelief at the man he had thought was just another victim. Marcus Johnson stood calmly in front of him, holding Craig's own weapons and looking completely in control of the situation. "This is impossible," Craig said, his voice shaking. "You were tied up in the warehouse. Pete and Danny were watching you." "How did you get out?" Marcus did not answer the question. Instead, he picked up Craig's notebook and began reading the plans for attacks on innocent families. The more he read, the angrier he became, though his face showed no emotion. "You plan to hurt children," Marcus said quietly. "The Washington family has a baby that is only 6 months old." Craig tried to act tough even though his hands were shaking. "Those people do not belong in our town. We were going to teach them a lesson about staying where they belong." Marcus set down the notebook and looked directly into Craig's eyes. For the first time, Craig saw something that made his blood turn cold. Marcus Johnson's eyes were the eyes of a man who had seen combat and death, and had never lost a fight when innocent people were in danger. "Tell me about your contacts in other states," Marcus said. "Tell me about the planned attacks next week." Craig realized that somehow he had captured the wrong people. These were not ordinary civilians who could be scared into submission. The man standing in front of him was clearly a trained soldier, probably special forces from the way he moved and talked. At the hardware store, Derek was having a similar conversation with Kyle Murphy. Kyle had been the second in command of the Iron Brotherhood, which meant he knew about all their plans and connections. "You cannot do this to us," Kyle said. "We have rights. You cannot just tie people up in their own homes." Derek was examining the weapons that Kyle had hidden in his apartment. There were enough guns to arm a small platoon, all purchased illegally or stolen from gun stores. You are planning to murder families with children, Derek said. You do not get to talk about rights. Derek had found Kyle's computer and was reading through emails between the Iron Brotherhood and similar groups in other states. There were plans for coordinated attacks on synagogues, mosques, and community centers where minorities gathered. The federal agents will want to see all of this, Derek said. You can either cooperate and tell them everything you know, or you can spend the rest of your life in prison while they figure it out themselves. Kyle's tough attitude disappeared when he realized that federal agents were involved. He had thought this was just a local matter that could be handled by local police who might be sympathetic to his cause. Back at the warehouse, Andre was questioning Rick Stone, Joey Martinez, and Frank Lewis all at the same time. The three men were tied to chairs in a circle, and Andre walked around them asking questions and comparing their answers. Who told you about the synagogue in the next county? Andre asked Rick. I do not know what you are talking about, Rick replied. Andre moved to Joey Martinez. Who told you about the synagogue in the next county? Joey was smarter than Rick and realized that lying was useless. Craig got the information from some guys in Alabama. They have been planning this for months. Andre moved to Frank Lewis. What guys in Alabama? Frank tried to stay quiet, but Andre just waited patiently. Frank had never been interrogated by a professional before, and the silence made him more nervous than any threats would have. There is a group called the White Eagles, Frank finally said. They have been sending Craig money and weapons. They want to start what they call a race war. Andre continued questioning the three men, building a complete picture of the network. The Iron Brotherhood was not just a local hate group. They were part of a larger organization with cells in at least 6 states, all planning attacks on innocent people. By 5 in the morning, the Johnson brothers had gathered enough information to shut down the entire network. They had names, addresses, phone numbers, email accounts, and detailed plans for attacks in multiple states. More importantly, they had prevented those attacks from happening. Without the Iron Brotherhood to carry out their part of the plan, the other groups would not be able to coordinate their attacks. Derek called their commanding officer again on the secure phone. Colonel Hayes listened as Derek reported what they had discovered. Within minutes, federal agents in 6 states were preparing to arrest dozens of domestic terrorists. At 6 in the morning, FBI agents arrived at the warehouse. Agent Lisa Carter was in charge of the Domestic Terrorism Task Force, and she had been tracking groups like the Iron Brotherhood for years. Which one of you wants to tell me how 3 civilians managed to capture an entire terrorist cell in one night? Agent Carter asked. The Johnson brothers looked at each other. They could not reveal their real identities without permission from their commanding officer, but they also could not lie to federal agents. We are not exactly civilians, Marcus said carefully. We work for the government in a security capacity that requires special training. Agent Carter looked at the 3 identical brothers, and then at the 8 captured terrorists. She had been doing this job for 15 years and had never seen anything like it. Special training, she repeated. What kind of special training teaches 3 men to take down 8 armed terrorists without firing a single shot? Andre stepped forward. The kind of training that teaches you to protect innocent people no matter what the cost. Agent Carter did not press for more details. She could see that these 3 men were professionals who had done everything correctly. They had captured the terrorists alive, gathered evidence properly, and called in federal agents as soon as possible. The most important thing was that innocent families were safe and a major terrorist plot had been stopped. Before it could begin, Craig Bennett finally realized the full extent of his mistake when he saw federal agents taking away boxes of evidence from his trailer. He had thought he was capturing 3 weak civilians who could be easily intimidated. Instead, he had kidnapped 3 highly trained government agents who had turned his entire organization over to the FBI. Who are you people? Craig asked as Agent Carter led him to a federal transport vehicle. Marcus Johnson looked at him one last time. We are Americans who believe that all people deserve to be safe in their homes, no matter what color their skin is. Kyle Murphy, Rick Stone, Joey Martinez, Frank Lewis, Pete Carson, Danny White, Tony Brooks, and Craig Bennett were all charged with domestic terrorism, conspiracy to commit murder, weapons violations, and hate crimes. The evidence that the Johnson brothers had gathered would keep them in federal prison for the rest of their lives. But the brothers were not finished yet. The information they had gathered led to arrests in Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, Tennessee, South Carolina, and Florida. Over 60 domestic terrorists were arrested in a coordinated operation that shut down the entire White Eagles network. The Johnson brothers sat in Agent Carter's office as the sun came up, filling out paperwork and answering questions. They had been awake for over 24 hours, but none of them looked tired. "I have been doing this job for 15 years, Agent Carter said. "I have never seen anything like what you three accomplished tonight." Derek smiled. "We had good teachers." Agent Carter handed them release papers. "Your commanding officer called and cleared you to return to civilian status. He said you are on leave for another week." The brothers thanked Agent Carter and walked out of the federal building into the morning sunlight. They had a promise to keep to their grandmother, who was expecting them for breakfast before their flights home. As they drove through the peaceful streets of Millbrook, they saw families starting their day. Children walked to school, parents headed to work, and elderly people sat on their porches reading newspapers. All of these people were safe because 3 Navy SEALs had refused to let terrorists hurt innocent families. But none of them would ever know how close they had come to becoming victims of hatred and violence. The Johnson brothers would never tell anyone what had really happened that night, not even their beloved grandmother. Some secrets were worth keeping if they protected the people you loved. Helen Johnson was waiting on her front porch when her 3 grandsons pulled into the driveway at 8 in the morning. She had been worried when they did not come back to the hotel the night before. But Marcus had called to tell her they had car trouble and would be late for breakfast. The old woman smiled as she watched her boys get out of their rental car. They looked tired, which was not surprising after being up all night dealing with car problems. She did not notice the small cuts on Marcus's hands or the way Derek kept checking the street behind them or how Andre's clothes looked like he had been crawling through bushes. "I was getting worried about you boys," Helen said as she hugged each of them. "I made extra pancakes because I figured you would be hungry after being up all night." The brothers sat around their grandmother's kitchen table eating breakfast and listening to her talk about the neighbors and local news. It felt good to be in the warm, safe kitchen where they had eaten thousands of meals as children. The local news was playing on the small television in the corner. The reporter was talking about a major FBI operation that had arrested several local men on terrorism charges. Helen shook her head as she listened to the story. "I cannot believe such terrible people were living right here in our town," she said, "planning to hurt innocent families with children. Thank God someone stopped them before they could hurt anyone." Marcus, Derek, and Andre exchanged glances but said nothing. They ate their grandmother's pancakes and listened to her talk about how proud she was to live in a country where the authorities protected people from dangerous criminals. After breakfast, the brothers helped their grandmother clean the kitchen and pack up leftover birthday cake. Their flights home were scheduled for that afternoon, and they needed to return the rental car and get to the airport. As they were getting ready to leave, Helen Johnson pulled out an old photo album and showed them pictures from when they were children. There were photos of 3 identical little boys playing in the backyard, building snow forts, and riding their bicycles. "You boys were always protecting each other," she said, pointing to a picture of 7-year-old Andre helping Marcus up after he fell off his bike, while Derek chased away older kids who had been teasing them. "Even when you were small, you never let anyone hurt your family." The brothers looked at the old photographs and remembered growing up in this house with the woman who had taught them right from wrong. She had raised them to believe that all people deserved respect and kindness, no matter what they looked like or where they came from. "We learned from the best teacher," Andre said, hugging his grandmother. Helen walked them to the car and hugged each grandson one more time. "You boys be safe out there," she said. "I know your work is important, but remember that your old grandmother worries about you." "We will always be careful, Grandma," Marcus promised. "And we will always come home." The brothers drove to the airport in comfortable silence. They had done their job and kept innocent people safe. The terrorists who had planned to hurt families were now in federal custody, and their network of hate had been destroyed. At the airport, they separated to catch flights to different cities, where they would report back to their units. Derek was heading to Virginia, Andre was flying to California, and Marcus had orders for Florida. Before they went through security, the 3 brothers shook hands and promised to stay in touch. They did not know when they would see each other again or when they would all be able to visit their grandmother at the same time. Good work last night, Derek said. Just like old times, Andre replied. Except this time we were protecting home, Marcus added. The brothers went through security and boarded their separate flights. By evening, they were back in their military units preparing for their next assignments. None of them filed reports about what had happened in Millbrook. Officially, they had been on leave visiting their grandmother for her birthday. 2 weeks later, Helen Johnson was reading the newspaper on her front porch when she saw a follow-up story about the FBI operation. The article said that the arrests in her town had led to the capture of over 60 domestic terrorists in 6 states. A major plot to attack innocent families had been prevented. The article quoted FBI agent Lisa Carter, who said that the investigation had been helped by 3 individuals who could not be identified for security reasons. These 3 people had provided crucial intelligence that allowed federal agents to stop the attacks before anyone was hurt. Helen smiled as she read the article. She was proud to live in a country where brave people worked behind the scenes to keep families safe. She had no idea that those 3 brave people were her own grandsons. 6 months later, Marcus Johnson was underwater off the coast of a country that could not be named, preparing to disable an enemy submarine that threatened American ships. Derek was on a rooftop in a desert city, providing sniper coverage for a rescue mission to save kidnapped aid workers. Andre was leading a team through a jungle to capture terrorists who had been planning attacks on civilian targets. The 3 brothers were thousands of miles apart, but they carried the same mission in their hearts: protect innocent people from those who would do them harm. They had learned this mission from their grandmother, who had taught them that all people deserve to be safe and free. They had practiced this mission in dozens of countries around the world, and they had proven this mission in their own hometown, when they stopped domestic terrorists from hurting the people they loved. Craig Bennett and his followers spent their days in federal prison, wondering how they had been defeated so completely by 3 men they had thought were easy victims. They would never understand that they had been defeated not by superior weapons or numbers, but by superior character. The Johnson brothers represented everything that America was supposed to be: brave people of all colors working together to protect freedom and justice for everyone. They proved that hatred based on skin color was not just morally wrong, but tactically stupid. Racists like Craig Bennett made the fatal mistake of judging people by their appearance instead of their character. They assumed that black men must be weak, when in reality they had kidnapped 3 of the most dangerous and capable soldiers in the world. In the end, the Iron Brotherhood learned that their racist beliefs had led them to catastrophically underestimate their opponents. They had expected to terrorize helpless victims, but instead found themselves facing men who had dedicated their lives to protecting the helpless. The story of what happened in Millbrook was never told in newspapers or history books. The Johnson brothers kept their secret and continued their work protecting America and its allies around the world. But sometimes, late at night when they were far from home, the 3 brothers would remember that kitchen table where they had eaten breakfast with their grandmother. After saving their hometown from terrorists, they would remember the pride in her voice when she talked about the brave people who protected innocent families. Helen Johnson lived to be 93 years old, never knowing that the 3 little boys she had raised had grown up to be heroes who saved countless lives. She died peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by photographs of her grandsons and proud of the good men they had become. At her funeral, Marcus, Derek, and Andre Johnson stood together in their dress uniforms, accepting thanks from neighbors who remembered them as polite young men who had loved their grandmother. None of those neighbors knew that these 3 men had once saved their lives and the lives of their children. The brothers buried their grandmother in the Millbrook Cemetery under an oak tree, where she had played as a child. On her headstone they had carved the words she had taught them: "All people deserve respect and kindness." As they stood by her grave, the Johnson brothers made a promise to continue the work she had started. They would keep protecting innocent people from those who would hurt them. They would keep proving that America's strength came not from hatred and division, but from brave people of all backgrounds working together for justice. The Iron Brotherhood had kidnapped 3 black men, thinking they were easy victims. Instead, they had awakened 3 American heroes who would spend their lives making sure that hatred could never triumph over love.